The US Secretary of State Antony Blinken's met with the Chinese Foreign Minister in Beijing. It's the highest profile visit to China by a US official since President Biden took office. Tensions remain high between the two nations over issues such as trade, technology and foreign policy. Mr. Blinken's visit was originally scheduled for February, but it was put on hold after the US found what it said was a Chinese spy balloon in its airspace. It's possible he will also meet President Xi during his stay. Well, our correspondent Stephen McDonald's in Beijing watching events. He says the trip is very symbolic.
Well, the fact that the meeting is even taking place is quite an achievement. I can't recall another visit by a US government official which has had such low expectations and yet which is so crucially important. I mean, the relationship is so toxic between Beijing and Washington. If at the end of these meetings, at least some new pathways towards communications, at least some new possibilities for more high-level meetings, if those types of things can be set up, I think both sides will be happy and think that they've come away with something, that it's been successful. But it's because relations are so bad that nobody expects any sort of a breakthrough on any of the key issues. And if they can just agree to keep talking, well, that'll be something.
So the meeting in itself is consequential. I remember a couple of weeks ago, there was a lot of conversation around a handshake between US and Chinese officials. What about the substance, though? Because it's not just about the meeting. I mean, there must be key issues on the table that the two would like to work together on.
Well, actually, there are to be a series of meetings. And so, first we have Antony Blinken meeting with his immediate counterpart, Qin Gang, who's China's foreign minister. But then, above Qin Gang is Wang Yi, so he's the Communist Party's foreign affairs official. And tomorrow, it's also possible that Antony Blinken could meet Xi Jinping. Now, we haven't had that confirmed, but there's a lot of talk that might happen. Now, you imagine the symbolism if that happens. We haven't had a meeting like this for 5 years here with a senior official from Washington speaking to anybody senior in Beijing. And so if Antony Blinken and Xi Jinping are to meet and shake hands, well, that will be quite symbolic. Now, sure, that doesn't get to the nuts and bolts of this relationship and what needs to be sorted out. And no doubt, in these meetings, they will be talking about all these problems with the South China Sea, freedom of navigation for ships. They'll be talking about human rights problems, about hacking, about trade problems. Both countries have tariffs on each other's products. All this needs to be sorted out. I mean, climate change, right down the bottom of the list, should be at the top of the list. And this is the problem for the world, really, that these global superpowers have got so many areas they're fighting about that they're not able to get together and cooperate on things like climate change, which really they have the same goal there, and there's no reason why they couldn't put their differences to one side and work together on climate change. But when everything's so nasty between these governments with a lot of sort of insults flying back and forth, it's hard to move forward. And that's why meetings like this are seen as crucial, to have some face time, as they say, to hopefully get momentum going again and at least stop the relationship from collapsing even further.
Stephen McDonald in Beijing there, while our correspondent Carl Nasman in Washington sets out what the US hopes to achieve from these talks.
Well, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken arrives in China at a moment when tensions between the two countries are very high and expectations for this trip are incredibly low. Of course, this is the first major re-engagement between the U.S. and China since that big saga over the alleged Chinese spy balloon, which floated across the United States back in February. And that really is hanging in the background of these talks. So the biggest goal here is a simple one, and it's just reestablishing and reopening those diplomatic lines of communication. There have been some concerns that this rivalry could escalate into some sort of conflict, especially after some of the close calls that we've seen between the two countries' military in the area around Taiwan. Secretary Blinken has called this de-risking, really just that simple matter of making sure that high-level officials on both sides can pick up the phone, can talk to each other in the case that anything might happen between those two nations. Blinken does have a long list of things he hopes to bring up, and he discussed this before his trip. He mentioned that he wants to address tensions in terms of trade, especially high-level technology like semiconductors. Of course, he'll be bringing up the issue of Taiwan and China's position on the war in Ukraine. He'll also mention the names of some American citizens that the U.S. says are illegally detained in China. And interestingly, the topic of fentanyl will be coming up. Secretary Blinken wants to address what he says are the raw building materials for that powerful drug that have been coming from China and then making its way across the border into the United States in the form of fentanyl. But again, no expectations for a big breakthrough here. The bar really has been lowered. And at the very least, the U.S. says they hope that this can lay the foundation and build the groundwork for further summits and further meetings between the U.S. and China in months to come.